continuing from our last theme, after the passage of the resolution for partition in the United Nations, I mentioned that war broke out in the Middle East. Now, resuming that theme, there were really two formative episodes that, to me, really does capture what transpired in that historic moment. If you remember, the first one really I began to discuss in the last segment was that Truman's position shifted back and forth after the United Nations vote. I mentioned that the State Department and the Defense Department were very strongly opposed to this. They thought it was irresponsible of us, and they got to President Truman. He changed his position, but once again he went for it. So that was the first episode. In the meantime, war is taking place in Palestine. Around 1948, when this 1948 war is occurring, it is not an exaggeration to say that the Jewish forces were really not at all outnumbered by the Arabs. The Jewish forces were in many ways far more stronger than the Arabs. They in fact had a force already in place anticipating Arabs' rejection of the partition that could defeat combined Arab assault. When the assault actually came, Syria had no army at all. Egypt had an army, but again, it was under the incompetent control of King Farouk, and so Egyptian army was really not a factor. There were really only two well-trained, and by well-trained I mean trained by the British, armies for the Arabs. One was in Iraq, and that army really never got engaged in force in any way in this conflict. The other army was the Arab Legion in Jordan. That one was commanded by the British, and it didn't get engaged heavily. So put yourself in place of the Arabs. When you go into war, Egypt and Syria really don't have much of an army. The two well-trained armies that you have, none of them get engaged in any meaningful sense. So the humiliating defeat that the Arabs experience in the hands of the Jews leads them to believe that the British planned this that way. In other words, for them, they blame the British for preventing their armies to engage in the war with the Jews. And as a result, they have this conviction that it was all conspiracy by the British. As I said, there is really not that much evidence that this was a planned type of activity by the British, that they wanted to deprive the Arabs. But as I said, those armies were not at all engaged. This brings me to the second formative episode after the partition plan, and this is the massacre at a village called Deir Yassin. This was a village of about roughly 400 villagers, and based on the partition plan, it was going to be in the Israeli part of, in the Israeli state to be created. Deir Yassin was a very peaceful village. In fact, evidence indicates that it had signed a non-aggression pact with the Jewish Agency. And it was headed really by notables. These are the so-called moderate responsible, who were widely viewed by other Arabs and other villagers as collaborators with the Jewish Agency. What is known is that on the night of April 9th, 1948, a combined forces of Irgun was an organization, a terrorist organization, a Jewish terrorist organization headed by Begin, Menachem Begin, who will become a prime minister of Israel in the future, in 1977 to be precise. And then the other group was the Stern Gang, altogether roughly about 132 strong, and these terrorists descend on a sleeping village. What is known about this episode is that by noon they had slaughtered about 115 villagers, men, women, and children. Their bodies were cut up and stuffed into wells. And remember, this was a collaborating village, not an antagonistic one. The British who investigated the massacre were convinced that this was a conscious decision by the Israelis to show the Arabs that not even collaborating Arabs will be safe. Whether that is in fact a kind of a deliberate plan or a kind of a on-the-spot decision is hard to say. But in terms of motivations, probably Begin had two motivations for undertaking this massacre. One, and most important, was for Begin to humiliate the British, because remember, the British, by this time, they were not at all enamored by Begin. In fact, Begin could never set foot in Britain because there was a warrant for his arrest. Even when he became Prime Minister of Israel, he couldn't go to Britain because of his terrorist activity. The other motivation that Begin had was to frighten the Arabs. So, given these two motivations, humiliate the British and frighten the Arabs, in 1948, after the Deir Yassin massacres, the Arabs took their kids, left the parrot home, and they were running for their lives. The United Nations investigated the episode, and their conclusion was that Irgun and its collaborators used mobile speakers to terrify the Arab population of the area to fleeing out of the area, telling them, remember Deir Yassin, remember Deir Yassin. They will not get any mercy. This episode was compounded by another one, and the fact that the Arab radio, they also began broadcasting the massacre as a news, because it was a news item. And the very fact that it was being broadcasted, that further helped to terrify the Arab masses into fleeing the area. So what you have is that Arabs are running out en masse, fearing for their lives, and where they're going is really to their relatives in the neighboring area to have a safe haven. Now, once the Arabs left, Israel did not allow them to return. The Arab case is simple. It really makes no difference as to why we fled the area, but everyone knows we fled because we were terrified. We were afraid more of Deir Yassin was going to happen. Therefore, we have every right to return and come back to our home. Israel's case, the Arabs fled because they were instigated by the Arab regimes, and now they have no right to return. So, I hope you understand that the significance of Deir Yassin massacre far exceeds the act itself. That massacre was a game changer. The fleeing Arabs in large numbers made it far more possible for what was to be Israel to become a Jewish state in its true sense. A lot more Jews than Arabs. So the significance of Deir Yassin is that the fleeing Arabs made it possible for Israel to be Jewish state and to be viable in a sense as a Jewish state than what de facto was a binational state, having a lot of Arabs in there. Now, going back to Palestine, the Palestinians are really overachieving and kind of uppity and among the best educated Arabs. In fact, sometimes Arabs refer to the Palestinian as the Jews of Arabs because the Jews are overachieving. Therefore, if you have that kind of a population, you know that in diaspora, they are going to have a very strong, very powerful desire to return. By early 1960s, the Palestinian identity is beginning to develop and it becomes increasingly intense. So this sense of Palestinian nationalism began to rapidly spread, and as it spread in their population, it began to push them as a people toward confrontation with Israel, who they regarded as usurpers of their land and their home. So now you're getting this sense of identity developing, and as you will see, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is going to stay there even if the Arab-Israeli conflict, Arab other than Palestinian-Israeli conflict is resolved. So with the Palestinians' identity shaping up and becoming much more pronounced and intense, because they were the people who were most directly affected by the creation of the State of Israel, you now have a new dimension added to the Arab-Israeli conflict, and that is, of course, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this one has proved to be most intractable because ultimately it's really a conflict over the same piece of real estate by the two populations. Now, notice I mentioned that by early 1960s, to repeat myself, the Palestinian identity is shaping and developing and manifesting itself. This has been a matter of debate with other scholars, including Rashid Khalidi, who claims that the Palestinian identity was there way before that. This is contentious because Golda Meir once remarked, "Who are Palestinians? Where do they come from?" The truth of the matter is, even though Khalidi would disagree with my interpretation, Palestine at the time of the creation of the State of Israel, or the Palestinians who lived there, the Arab Palestinians, they were really in a pre-mass politics. And as the rule is under pre-mass politics, your identity by definition will be parochial. It would be with your extended family and with your village rather than a national identity. So therefore, in some sense, Golda Meir was right because this notion of Palestinian nationalism is something that's going to develop later. Now that doesn't make it any less legitimate for their case. It's just a political expression that the national identity of Palestinian developed as they entered mass politics and as they experienced the trauma of the creation of a State of Israel on their land. But the point, though, is that I am disagreeing with Rashid Khalidi's point that the identity was always there. The identity may have been there for 1% of the population, the intellectuals and the elites, but certainly for the average masses, the identity was their villages, a parochial identity rather than a national